A pleasant day to all. I am Maria Angela Macomis from English 3A. In this video lecture, we will be focusing on the topics which is all about constructivism. So let's see our objectives for today's discussion. At the end of the lesson, 100% of the students with 85% level of proficiency should be able to define constructivism. Second, describe the essential components to constructivist teaching. Third, differentiate the types of constructivism. And create diagram for theories of constructivism. Then, as you can see on the screen are the topics under constructivism, such as the constructivism itself, of course. Second is the consequences for the classroom, followed by the essential components to constructivist teaching, then example of constructivist classroom activities, and the fifth topic is principle of constructivism, also the types of constructivism, and lastly, the theories under constructivism. But before we focus on our lesson proper, let's have a quick activity called word association. I know we are all very familiar with this icebreaker, but just to make sure that everyone will participate, I'll just explain everything. So I will just show you words, and please chat in the chat box the words you think of the moment you see and read the word on your screen. Like, let's have an example. When we say dinner, some of us may think of night, possibly because dinners occurs at night. It happens at night, obviously. Or we may think of lunch, food, eat, or restaurants. Whatever comes to your mind that is associated with that specific given word will suffice, because there's no correct answer here. So feel free to chat all the words that pop into your mind, as I will be giving you 15 seconds to share your thoughts. Alright, I'm much aware that everyone is ready now. So let's have our first word. Our first word is teacher. Okay, some of the answer might be school, student, profession, learning, and many more. So how about the second word? Let's see. And the second word is traditional. Time's up. Some of you might associate it as old or norms or historic. Anyways, all your answers are correct. And lastly, of course, our topic itself. Let's see, what do you think of constructivism? Maybe some of you haven't encountered constructivism. That's why we are here to learn about it, and it's fine. That's why we are here, and you are here to learn about constructivism. But we may associate it to, let's see, maybe theory, approach, or learner, and actually many more, but I won't spoil you this early about constructivism. So I hope you had a great start. So moving on, really, what is constructivism? So it's stated here that it is a theory that says learners construct knowledge rather than passively take in information. Also, learners incorporate new information into their pre-existing knowledge, which we also called as schemas. Meaning, what constructivism trying to tell us that learners, we construct knowledge on our own, and this definitely happened because of our experiences, that we do reflect and build representations on our mind, and we incorporate the new information, the newly acquired information we had where we learn into our pre-existing knowledge, which also known as schemas, and related to these are the assimilation and accommodation. Wherein assimilation, it is refers to the process of taking new information and fitting it into an existing schema. While in accommodation, it refers to using newly acquired information to revise and redevelop an existing schema. You may be wondering what would be the difference between the two. Well, in assimilation, the new information we acquire, what we do with it is to fit it into an existing schema. While in accommodation, the new information is to revise and redevelop an existing schema. Like, have you heard about the concept of relearn? Well, that's kind of help us with this. So, to deeply understand it, let's have an example. So if I believe that friends are always nice and I meet a new person who is always nice to me, so I may call this person a friend, and that is assimilating them into my schema because I'm trying to fit in the new information into the existing schema. But perhaps, however, I meet a different person who sometimes pushes me to try harder, and it is not always nice. So I may decide to change my schema to accommodate this person, like by deciding to think that a friend doesn't always need to be nice. So further, this make me reconsider whether the first person still fits into my friend schema. So I hope that example help you a lot with differentiating the assimilation into the accommodation. Next, the consequences of constructivist theory, and that are the first, students learn best when engaged in learning experiences rather than passively receiving information. Second, learning is inherently a social process because it is embedded within a social context as students and teachers work together to build knowledge. Also, third, because knowledge cannot be directly imparted to students, the goal of teaching is to provide experiences that facilitate the construction of knowledge. And this last point is worth repeating because we all have an idea of traditional approach, right? In teaching, the traditional approach, it focuses on delivering information to students. Yet in constructivism, it began to differ because it argues that you cannot directly impart this information because only an experience can facilitate students to construct their own knowledge. So therefore, the goal of teaching is to just design these experiences, not to feed the students with the knowledge itself. Down to our second topic, consequences for the classroom. So there are many consequences for teaching in the classroom if you adhere to constructivist principles. So the following chart you will be encountering, you will be seen is from the Teaching and Learning Resources Wiki. It comes from that a website where it compares traditional and constructivist classroom across several components. There are so many components comparing these two. So, in traditional classroom, a curriculum begins with the parts of the whole, emphasizes basic skills, while in constructivist classroom, the curriculum emphasizes big concepts beginning with the whole and then expanding to include the parts. Second, in traditional classroom, its strict adherence to fixed curriculum is highly valued, while on the other side, its pursuit of student questions and interest is valued. Next, materials are primarily textbooks and workbooks, while in constructivist, materials include primary sources of material and manipulative materials. In traditional classroom, learning is based on repetition, while on the other side, learning is interactive, building on what the student already knows. Next, teachers disseminate information to students, and students are recipients of knowledge. while in constructivist, teachers have a dialogue with students, helping students construct their own knowledge. In traditional classroom, teacher's role is directive. It is rooted in authority. While in constructivist, teacher's role is interactive. It's rooted in negotiation. In traditional classroom, assessment is through testing and correct answers, while in constructivist classroom, the assessment includes students' works, observations, and points of view as well as tests. And process is as important as product. So, last two, in traditional classroom, knowledge is seen as inert, while in constructivist classroom, knowledge is seen as dynamic and it is ever changing with our experiences. And students work primarily alone in traditional classroom, while on the other side, students work primarily in groups. I hope you see the difference between the traditional classroom and the constructivist classroom. And that's conclude the comparison between the two. So on our topic 3, we will be discussing the essential components to constructivist teaching. So there are several main components to include if you plan on adhering to constructivist principles in your classroom or when designing your lesson. So the following are from Baviskar, Hartel, and Whitney, 2009. So the first essential component to constructivist teaching is the elicit prior knowledge. So it's stated here that new knowledge is created in relation to learners' pre-existing knowledge or the schema. So indeed, the lessons therefore require eliciting relevant prior knowledge wherein teachers activate the prior knowledge from students with what they already know and building initial knowledge that they need in order to access upcoming content. Then, of course, the activities include pre-tests, informal interviews, and small group warm-up activities that require recall of prior knowledge. Second essential component is create cognitive dissonance. So assign problems and activities that will challenge students. So the teachers must assign problems that will challenge students. So knowledge is built as learners encounter novel problems and revise existing schemas as they work through the challenging problem. What it meant here in the create cognitive dissonance, well, the term cognitive dissonance is used to describe the mental discomfort that results from holding two conflicting beliefs, either even values or attitudes. That's why students tend to seek consistency, and teachers giving them problems to solve as an activity will help them to acquire the knowledge. And next is apply knowledge with feedback. So encourage students to evaluate new information and modify existing knowledge. So activities should allow for students to compare pre-existing schema to the novel situation. And also activities might include presentations, small group or class discussions, and even quizzes. And lastly, for the essential component, reflects on learning. So provide students with an opportunity to show you and of course themselves what they have learned. And activities might include presentations, reflexive papers, or creating a step-by-step tutorial for another student. And for our topic 4, examples of constructivist classroom activities. First is reciprocal teaching or learning. So in reciprocal teaching, it allows pairs of students to teach each other. Also, an instructional activity in which students become the teacher in small group reading sessions. So teachers, being the model, then help students learn to guide group discussions using 4 strategies, that is summarizing, question generating, clarifying, and predicting. While in inquiry-based learning or IBL, learners pose their own questions and seek answers to their questions via research and direct observation. So they present their supporting evidence to answer the questions. And also they draw connections between their pre-existing knowledge and the knowledge they have acquired through the activity. And finally, they draw conclusions, highlighting remaining gaps in knowledge and develop plans for future investigation. So, in examples of inquiry-based labs, it could be video. Also, in inquiry-based labs, a case study in biological sciences, they could do it video too. So, next is problem-based learning or PBL. Well, the main idea of PBL is similar to IBL because learners acquire knowledge by devising a solution to a problem. And PBL differs from IBL in that PBL activities provide students with real-world problems that require students to work together to devise a solution, to even have alternative solutions or have plan A, plan B, plan C to plan Z, whatever it is. As the group works through the challenging real world problems, learners then acquire communication and collaboration skills in addition to knowledge. That's why it is problem based learning. Okay, how about cooperative learning? Well, students work together in a small groups to maximize their own and each other's learning. Well, in cooperative learning, it differs from typical group work in that it requires interdependence among group members to solve a problem or complete an assignment. Next is our topic 5, which is the principles of constructivism. The first principle is knowledge is constructed rather than innate or passively absorbed. Well, constructivism's central idea is that human learning is constructed, that learners build new knowledge upon the foundation of previous learning. So this prior knowledge influences what new or modified knowledge an individual will construct from new learning experiences. And second principle is the learning is an active process. Well, the second notion is that learning is an active rather than a passive process because on the passive view of teaching, it views the learner as an empty vessel that needs to be filled with knowledge, whereas constructivism states that learners construct meaning only through active engagement with the world, such as experiments or just give teachers give the students a real world problem solving. So information here may be passively received, but understanding cannot be, for it must come from making meaningful connections between the prior knowledge, the new knowledge, and the processes involved in learning. And letter C, all knowledge is socially constructed. So learning is a social activity. It is something we do together in interaction with each other rather than an abstract concept, and that is from Dewey, 1938. For example, Vygotsky stated that he believed that community plays a central role in the process of making meaning. So for Vygotsky, the environment in which children grow up will influence how they think and what they think about. Thus, all teaching and learning is a matter of sharing and negotiating socially constituted knowledge. And also, Vygotsky stated an example that in cognitive development stems from social interactions, from guided learning within the zone of proximal development as children and their parents co-construct knowledge. And letter D, all knowledge is personal. So each individual learner has a distinctive point of view based on existing knowledge and values, and we respect that. And this means that the same lesson, teaching, or activity may result in different learning by each pupil, by each student, as their subjective interpretations differ, as of course they are different. They have different comprehension too, and understanding. So this principle appears to contradict the view of the knowledge is socially constructed, as it says here that all knowledge is personal. Letter E. Learning exists in the mind. The constructivist theory posits that knowledge can only exist within the human mind and that it does not have too much any real world reality. So learners will be constantly trying to develop their own individual mental model of the real world, and it's from their own perceptions of what the world is. So, as they perceive each new experience, learners will continually update their own mental models to reflect the new information and will therefore construct their own interpretations of reality and what world seems for them to be. And that's all about the principles of constructivism. Let's move on to the types of constructivism. The types of constructivism, it's typically this continuum is divided into three broad categories. A. Cognitive constructivism based on the work of Jean Piaget. Letter B. Social constructivism based on the work of Lev Vygotsky. And C. Radical constructivism. So according to the cognitive constructivism, it states that knowledge is something that is actively constructed by learners based on their existing cognitive structure. So therefore, learning is relative to their stage of cognitive development. It has the stages of cognitive development. So also, cognitivist teaching methods aim to assist students in assimilating new information to existing knowledge. So it enabled them to make the appropriate modifications to their existing intellectual framework to accommodate that information. And letter B, according to social constructivism, learning is a collaborative process and knowledge develops from individuals' interaction with their culture and society. So social constructivism was developed by Lev Vygotsky, who suggested that every function in the child's cultural development appears twice, first on the social level and later on the individual level. Well, first, between people, it is interpsychological. We also called it as that. And then inside the child, it is intra-psychological. And that's all about the social constructivism. In letter C, the notion of radical constructivism was developed by Ernst von Glasersfeld in 1974, and he states that all knowledge is constructed rather than perceived through senses. So learners here to construct new knowledge on the foundations of their pre-existing knowledge. However, in radical constructivism, it states that the knowledge individuals create tells us nothing about reality and only helps us to function in your environment. Thus, knowledge is invented, not discovered. And the explanation is that the humanly constructed reality is all the time being modified and interacting to fit ontological reality, although it can never give a true picture of it. Moving on, next slide, let's take a look of the constructivist approaches to teaching. So, constructivist learning theory underpins a variety of student-centered teaching methods and techniques, which contrast with traditional education whereby knowledge is simply passively transmitted by teachers to students. And having said that, aren't you wondering now of the role of teachers in a constructivist classroom? Well, the primary responsibility of the teacher is to create a collaborative problem-solving environment, because that is constructivist classroom all about, where students become active participants in their own learning. And from this perspective, a teacher acts as a facilitator of learning rather than an instructor. So the teacher makes sure he or she understands the students' pre-existing conceptions. That's why there's always been pre-test and guide, so we can so teachers, we can guide the activity to address them and then build on them or build on the students. Wherein scaffolding is a key feature of an effective teaching, where the adult continually adjusts the level of his or her help in response to the learner's level of performance. We teachers adjust to it. So in the classroom, scaffolding can include modeling a skill, even providing hints or cues, and adapting material or activity. Alright, then the pedagogical, and that is teaching, goals of constructivist classroom. So Honeybee 1996 summarizes the 7 pedagogical goals of constructivist learning environment. First, to provide experience with the knowledge construction process, so students to determine how they will learn. Second, to provide experience in and appreciation for multiple perspective. Well, it is possible when it comes to evaluation of alternative solutions. C, to embed learning in a realistic context, meaning in a simple term, it should have authentic tasks. Letter D, to encourage ownership and a voice in the learning process. It should be student-centered learning. Letter E, to embed learning in social experiences. So this could happen through collaboration or group tasks. And letter F, to encourage the use of multiple modes of representation such as video, audio, text, and many more. And lastly, letter G, to encourage awareness of the knowledge construction process. We could do it through reflection or metacognition. So next slide, Brooks and Brooks 1993 list 12 descriptors of constructivist teaching behaviors. Letter A, it encourages and accepts student autonomy and initiative. Also, the constructivist teaching behavior also use raw data and primary sources along with manipulative, interactive, and physical materials. Maybe you are wondering why manipulative, because it will be the teachers will also be grounded with the different learners. And letter C, when framing tasks, use cognitive terminology such as classify, analyze, predict, and create. I know you are knowledgeable about the taxonomy of education. It is that. So letter D, allows student responses to drive lessons, shift instructional strategies, and alter content. And letter E, inquire about students' understanding of the concepts before sharing your own understandings of those concepts. That's why we opt to ask questions on the students, and also that's why we did the word association earlier, so that we can know what would be your thoughts about those certain given words. And that's part of constructivist theory. Letter F, encourage students to engage in dialogue, both with the teacher and with one another. Letter G, encourage students' inquiry by asking thoughtful, open-ended questions and encouraging students to ask questions of each other. H, seek elaborations of students' initial responses. I, engage students in experiences that might engender contradictions to their initial hypothesis and then encourage discussion. J, allow wait time after posing questions, because they're still internalizing everything about the discussions. Letter K, provide time for students to construct relationship and create metaphors. And lastly, nurture students' natural curiosity through frequent use of the learning cycle mode. And lastly, for our topic 7, these are the theories with regards to constructivism. First thing first is Bruner's constructivist theory. Next is gestalt theory. And lastly, subsumption learning theory. So let's have first with Bruner's constructivist theory. So the proponent here is Jerome Bruner, and the theory, as you can see on your screen, the theory views that new knowledge is based on previous knowledge or the pre-existing knowledge. Also put emphasis on categorization in learning. So Bruner's has these three modes of representation. First is the enactive representation or action. It is action based. While second is iconic representation, and it is image based. Then third, symbolic representation, which is language based. So Bruner was concerned with how knowledge is represented and organized through different modes of thinking or representations. So in his research on the cognitive development of children, Jerome Bruner proposed three modes of representation. And that is what I mentioned earlier. So Bruner's constructivist theory suggests that it is effective when we faced with new material to follow a progression from enactive to iconic to symbolic representation, and this holds true even for adult learners. So Bruner's work also suggests that a learner even of a very young age is capable of learning any material. So as long as the instruction is organized and appropriately, in sharp contrast to the beliefs of Piaget and other stage theories. So the Bruner's three modes of representation. First is enactive. It is 0 to 1 year. It is the first kind of memory. This mode is used when within the first year of life. It is corresponding with Piaget's sensory motor stage, if you can remember or know. Thinking is based entirely on physical actions, and infants learn by doing rather than by internal representation or thinking. That's why it is action based. So it involves encoding a physical action based information and storing it in our memory. For example, in the form of movement as a muscle memory, a baby might remember the action of shaking a rattle. So this mode continues later in many physical activities as the child also develops. So such as learning to ride a bike. So many adults can perform a variety of motor tasks such as typing, sewing a shirt, operating a lawnmower, and that they would find difficult to describe in iconic or picture or symbolic word form. So as I have mentioned, so iconic, it happens in 1 to 6 years of age. So it is information stored as sensory images or icons. So usually visual ones like pictures in the mind. For some this is conscious, others say they don't experience it. So this may explain why when we are learning a new subject, it is often helpful to have diagrams or illustration to accompany the verbal information, because thinking is also based on the use of other mental images or icons such as hearing, smell, or touch. While in symbolic, this is 7 years onwards. So this develops last. This is the last one to develop. So this is where information is stored in the form of a code or symbol such as language. So this mode is acquired around 6 to 7 years old, and this is correspond to Piaget concrete operational stage. So in the symbolic stage, knowledge is stored primarily as words, mathematical symbols, or in other symbol systems such as music. And also symbols are flexible in that they can be manipulated, ordered, classified, so that the user or the learner isn't constrained by actions or images. So we have a fixed relation to that which they are represent. Okay, while in educational implications with Brunner's theory, well, the aim of education should be to create autonomous learners, and that is learning to learn. So for Brunner, the purpose of education is not to impart knowledge, but instead to facilitate a child's thinking and problem-solving skills, which can then be transferred to a range of situations. Specifically, education should also develop symbolic thinking in children. So the main premise of Brunner's text was that students are active learners who construct their own knowledge. So he have here a readiness. Well, it is opposed to Piaget's notion of readiness. So Brunner's argued that schools waste time trying to match the complexity of subject material to a child's cognitive stage of development. So this means that students are held back by teachers by a certain topics and are redeemed to difficult to understand and must be taught when the teacher believes that the child has reached the appropriate stage of cognitive maturity. While in the spiral curriculum, Brunner adopts a different view and believes that a child of any age is capable of understanding complex information, because in here they begin with the hypothesis that any subject can be taught effectively in some intellectually honest form. So also Brunner explained in spiral curriculum that it was possible through the concept of the spiral curriculum that it involved information being structured so that the complex ideas can be taught at a simplified level first and then revisited at more complex levels later on. So it will begin with the simple up to the complex level. So therefore, the subjects would be taught at levels of gradually increasing difficulty. Hence, this spiral is analogical. So ideally, teaching this way should lead to children being able to solve problems by themselves. Next is the discovery learning, and this would be the last one, proposes that learners construct their own knowledge and do this by organizing and categorizing information using a coding system. So Brunner believed that the most effective way to develop a coding system is to discover it rather than being told by the teacher. So the concept of discovery learning implies that students construct their own knowledge for themselves, and the role of teacher should not be to teach information by rote learning, but instead to facilitate the learning process. So let's now learn about gestalt theory. So the key takeaways is that Gestalt psychology is a school of thought that seeks to understand how the human brain perceives experiences. It suggests that structures perceived as a whole and have a specific properties that are different from the sum of their individual parts. So for instance, when reading a text, a person or a student perceives each word and sentence as a whole with meaning rather than seeing individual letters, and while each letter form it is an independent individual unit. So the greater meaning of the text depends on the arrangement of the letter into a specific configuration. Because the Gestalt principles or laws of perception explain how this behavior of pattern seeking operates. So they offer a powerful framework to understand human perception and yet are simple to assimilate and implement. So for that reason, the Gestalt laws are appealing not only to psychologists but also to visual artists, educators, and communicators. So in loose translation, the German word Gestalt, it means configuration or structure. It makes a reference to the way individual components are structured by our perception as a physical whole. So that structure would provide us a scientific explanation for why changes in spacing, organization, and timing can radically transform how information is received and assimilated. So, how the Gestalt approach formed? Well, there are two main philosophical influences of Gestalt there, and they are Kantian epistemology and Husserl's phenomenological method. So both Kant and Husserl sought to understand humans' consciousness and perceptions of the world. So they are arguing that those mental processes are not entirely mediated by rational thought. So similarly to Gestalt researchers were Wertheimer, Kafka, and Kohler, they observe that the human brains tends to automatically organize and interpret visual data through grouping. So they also theorize that because of those mental shortcuts, the perception of the whole is different from the sum of individual elements. So let's dig deeper and deeply be familiar with Gestalt psychologists. First is Max Wertheimer. Well, the inaugural article of Gestalt psychology was Max Wertheimer's Experimental Studies of the Perception of Movement, and it was published in 1912. And Wertheimer then at the Institute of Psychology in Frankfurt am Main described in this article is a visual illusion which called as apparent motion. So apparent motion, it is the perception of movement that results from viewing a rapid sequence of static images, and as happens in the movies or in flip books. So Wertheimer realized that the perception of the whole or the group of figures in a sequence was radically different from the perceptions of its components or each static image. While Wolfgang Kohler was particularly interested in physics and natural sciences, so he introduced the concept of psychophysical isomorphism. It is arguing that how a stimulus is received is influenced by the brain's general state while perceiving it. So he believed that organic processes tend to evolve to a state of equilibrium, and much like a soap bubbles that start in various shapes but always tend to change into perfect spheres because that is their minimum energy. While lastly, Kurt Kafka, he contributed to expand Gestalt applications beyond visual perception. In his major article, which is entitled Principles of Gestalt Psychology, 1935, he detailed the application of the Gestalt laws to topics such as motor action, learning, and memory. So Gestalt laws of perceptual organization was formalized by Wertheimer in a treaty published in 1923 and further elaborated by Kohler, and Kafka. So the principles are grounded on the human natural tendency of finding order in disorder. It is a process that happens in the brain and not in the sensory organs such as the eye. So although these principles operate in a predictable way, they are actually mental shortcuts to interpret information. And as shortcuts, they sometimes make mistakes, and that is why they can lead to incorrect perceptions. So these are pregnance. The law of pregnance is also called of law of simplicity or law of good figure. It states that when we faced with a set of ambiguous or complex objects, the human brain seeks to make them as simple as possible. That's why it is a good figure. Next is similarity. This law suggests that we tend to group shapes, objects, or design elements that share some similarity, be it in terms of color, shape, orientation, texture, or size. And next is proximity. The law of proximity states that the shapes, objects, or design elements located near each other tend to be perceived as a group. Conversely, randomly located items don't tend to be perceived as isolated. So this principle can be applied with the goal of directing attention to key elements within the design that has a closer visual elements with each other. So the more likely they will be perceived as related to each other, and too much negative space between elements serve to isolate them from one another. While in the common region, this law proposes that elements that are located within same close region, such as inside a circle or a shape, tend to be perceived as belonging to the same group. So those clearly defined boundaries between the inside and the outside of a shape creates a stronger connection between elements. So, in continuity, this law argues that shapes, objects, or design elements that are positioned in a way that suggests lines, curves, or planes will be perceived as such and not as individual elements. So, we perceptually group the elements together to form a continuous image. And lastly, closure. This law suggests that the human brain has a natural tendency to visually close gaps in forms, particularly when identifying familiar images. So when information is missing, our focus goes to what is present and automatically fills the missing parts with familiar lines, colors, or patterns. So, the classic gestalt principles have been extended in various directions, and the ones above are some of the most commonly cited, but there are others such as the symmetry principle or symmetrical components will tend to be grouped together, and but we will be discussing as enough of that because we will be moving on to they applying Oshabal subsumption theory in e-learning. So David Oshabal, a noted American psychologist who specialized in education and learning behaviors, introduced the subsumption theory back in 1963. So it centers on the idea that learners can more effectively acquire new knowledge if it is tied to their existing knowledge base, and that only unique information that stands out within the lesson is committed to memory. So, according to Oshabal's subsumption theory, a learner absorbs new information by trying it to existing concepts and ideas that they have already acquired. That's the thing I kept repeating even on the start of the discussion. So rather than building an entirely new cognitive structure, they are able to relate it to information that is already present within their minds. Okay, next. So when an idea is forgotten, it is simply because the specific details and associated thoughts get lost in the crowd and can no longer be differentiated from other pieces of information. So based upon this theory, meaningful learning can only occur once the subsumed cognitive structures have been fully developed. So the subsumption theory has a basic principles. It is to utilize the subsumption theory in e-learning. So it is important to identify the two types of subsumption that exist, such as the correlative and derivative. So both of these are forms of rote learning, which has the ability to gradually construct new cognitive behaviors and structures within the minds of your learners. So after these cognitive structures are built, the learner then has the power to use them during meaningful learning activities and exercises. So here are the differences between the two types of subsumption as suggested by Oshabal. So, well, correlative, a learner collects new information that extends from their existing knowledge based or elaborates upon previously acquired information. While in derivative, a learner derives new information directly from their cognitive structures or identifies relationships between concepts with their existing knowledge base. So this can be achieved in a variety of ways, from shifting information around in the hierarchical structure to linking ideas together to create new meanings. So there are 4 tips to apply Oshibal subsumption theory in e-learning. First is lead off with the key takeaways. So begin your e-learning course with a general overview that highlights everything the learners need to know by the end, and then sequence online material from general to specific. And that is the process Oshibal calls progressing differentiation. So this will help the learner to automatically categorize the e-learning content and figure out where it belongs in their cognitive structure. So for example, if you let them know that the e-learning course covers animal genus concepts, so they can immediately access their animal classifications knowledge. So it is in order for them to build upon it and apply it when participating in the e-learning course. In lead off with the key takeaways, it offers greater detail as you progress through the e-learning module so that your learners can begin to differentiate it from other pieces of information so they have already collected. Remember, the key to knowledge is retention. It is connecting the concepts, then making them stand out from the crowd so that they are not easily forgotten. Second tip, encourage learners to apply previously acquired knowledge. So speaking of connecting, the subsumption theory relies heavily on the idea that learners gather information most effectively when they tie new concepts to existing cognitive structure. So this works both ways. However, they can also apply information they have already learned in order to improve comprehension and knowledge retention. So in many aspects in many respects, it has a two-way street that gives learners the opportunity to acquire new knowledge while they are committing old knowledge to their long-term memory banks. So whenever possible, integrate e-learning scenarios and simulations that allow them to apply existing knowledge while discovering new concepts and ideas. While the third tip include both receptive and discovery-based activity. Although Oshibal found no special advantages for discovery learning, but as he believed that it has the same effect on learning being more time-consuming, it is not bad idea to include both receptive and discovery-based, because in the real world, they won't be taking written assessment to test their knowledge. Instead, they will have to apply it in a wide range of settings to overcome their challenges and solve real-life problems. Thus, teachers need to ensure that they are not only learning the information, but that they can also apply it outside of the virtual classroom. And lastly, for the tip and for our discussion in this video lecture, make it meaningful. Despite the fact that subsumption theory deals primarily with rote learning principles, its still primarily goal is to create meaningful learning experiences. So meaningful learning occurs when an individual is able to create connections between what they learned and what they already know within their cognitive structures of their minds. So essentially, they tie it into an existing knowledge and commit it to memory. So we have to integrate problem-solving online activities that focus on past experiences and integrate stories that trigger their emotions. So use real-world examples, teachers, that stress the benefits of learning of the subject matter and help them relate to ideas or concepts. And that's all about constructivism. I hope you learned a lot. Thank you for listening.